Hello and welcome to Mambel Technology Group. In our previous video, we learned about virtual machines. We saw what is a virtual machine and how it works. We talked about hypervisor and we saw the two types of hypervisor. We talked about a type 1 hypervisor or the bare metal and the type 2 hypervisor or the hosted hypervisor. So in this series, we are going to go ahead and see how to create a virtual machine or how to deploy a virtual machine. And in this case, our virtual machine is going to be a Hyper-V virtual machine, right? So how do you go about enabling virtualization on your system? That is a first step in creating a virtual machine. You need to enable virtualization. And to do that, you would need to go into your system and look to turn on some features, right? You would need to bring up some features, turn on some features, enable virtualization in case you are using Windows operating system. And in my situation, I am using a Windows 11 operating system. So I will need to enable Hyper-V. As you can see, this is where you need to do that. If it is checked off, you need to check this on, and it will prompt you to reboot your system. So this is where you enable your Hyper-V, and you have the component here, the Hyper-V platform, the Hyper-V management tools. Once this is enabled, you will have to restart your computer in order for this to take effect. And once you turn this feature on, then you can go ahead and look, it will enable your Hyper-V manager, right? Because you will need to use your Hyper-V manager to create your hypervisor or to create your virtual machines. So in some cases, I've seen situations where some people are unable to see the Hyper-V here. In that situation, sometimes you will need to go through the BIOS to enable your virtualization. I've seen situations where I had to use, from the PC to boot and then interrupt the boot and go to the BIOS and enable virtualization in the BIOS. But I'm lucky enough on this PC, on this computer, I have Hyper-V enabled here. All right, once that is done, what you will see now, you will need to bring up your Hyper-V manager. Once you enable virtualization, then it will enable this Hyper-V manager. And it is with the Hyper-V manager that we will need to build our virtual machine. And by default, it picks the name of my laptop, which is MTG. At this time, you can see in the Hyper-V manager, I don't have no virtual machines because once you create virtual machines, they will be listed down here. Now, it's important to take a look at this Hyper-V manager to try to understand certain things, because once you build a virtual machine, depending on the purpose for which you're building that, you will need to make use of these components right here. Some of these, and the most important here first, is the virtual switch manager, right? You will need to create a virtual switch. You can use an internal virtual switch, which is just going to create an internal network within your virtual machines to communicate with each other. Or you can use the external virtual switch, which means that your computer or your virtual machine will be exposed to the internet and you can make connection outside of that network. Again, how do you create a virtual machine? Before you create a virtual machine, make sure you have a name of the virtual machine and you have uh, the ISO file. Which operating system are you going to be running on your virtual machine? In this situation, in my case, I will be using Windows Server 2016 operating system. I have already downloaded it and I have it to save somewhere in my file. That is what I will be using to install to install my virtual machine. I almost said SQL Server. We'll get there. So the first step is to right click here, right? You go here, you can come on your Hyper-V here. You right click on your Hyper-V manager on the name of your computer. You go to new and then you have virtual machines. The steps are pretty easy and it is straightforward to create a VM. And it's so good because it gives you this graphical user interface that you can use and you can read through it. It tells you basically what it's going to be doing, and it tells you the purpose of a virtual machine. For example, it says this wizard helps you to create a virtual machine. You can use a virtual machine in place of a physical computer for a variety of uses. And we mentioned this in our first video. So we're just going to go on next. Here, it is asking you, what is the virtual machine name? How do you want to call this virtual machine? So I will call it prod as production. I'm assuming that I will be using this virtual machine for production, or I can call this one node 1. Node 1, that is the name of my virtual machine. Now, where do you want to store your virtual machine? You can create a folder or use an existing folder to store your virtual machine, right? Because once you create your virtual machine, it creates some virtual disk at the back end, and those root files needs to be stored somewhere. By default, it will be pointing to the C drive, but I don't want it to go to the C drive because I definitely don't want to saturate my physical machine or my operating system, and that is a good practice. So I will browse and look to see where I can see uh, where I can store my virtual machine. And in this case, I'll go to this PC. I want to use my M drive, and I think I have a folder called Hyper-V right here. I'll select this folder. That is where I want to save every files that belongs to this virtual machine. The next step, just click on next. Now you have two generations of virtual machine. And I will always recommend to go with the second generation or generation 2. And from the reading here, you see it tells you that it gives you more advanced functionality. So choose the second generation. Next. Here, it's the RAM or the memory of your virtual machine. Depending on the purpose or the need you're going to be using this virtual machine for, you should assign the RAM here. Now, I don't need too much memory on this virtual machine, so I'm just going to assign it 1024 megabyte, that is 1 gigabit. And what I'm basically saying here, I'm saying go on my physical computer and take 1 gigabit or 1024 megabyte worth of memory and use it. And I will advise to tick this box which says use dynamic memory for this virtual machine. This is extremely important. And what does it mean? It says when you decide to how much memory to assign to a virtual machine, consider how you intend to use the virtual machine and the operating system that it will run. And by enabling dynamic memory for this virtual machine, you're basically telling this virtual machine that when the memory can expand dynamically as the virtual machine is growing or as the needs of the memory are increasing, or reduce when it is not actually needing that much memory to use. So click on next. Here it is looking for the connection, network connection. Remember, I talked about the Hyper-V, the virtual switch earlier. So at this point, we're not going to use no connection. We're just going to go with a default switch, and I'll explain it down the line when we start doing the connection between virtual machines. Next, here it is going to create this virtual disk, and the virtual disk will be stored where we stored our virtual machine, to the folder in which we pointed our virtual machine. You also need to provide a size. How much space do you want to assign to this virtual machine? Because it's just for training purpose and I don't need that much space, I'm just going to go ahead with 100 gigabit. But you can see here in this bracket, it says you can have a maximum of 64 terabyte for a virtual machine. I've never seen this. This is going to be, for you to spin up a virtual machine worth this size, your physical uh, your physical server or your physical computer definitely needs to have beyond this size. So if you happen to have an existing virtual disk, then you can just connect it here. But I don't have any, so I will go with this initial size here of 100 gigabit. Next, here is now the type of operating system you want to use for this virtual machine. In my case, I'm using a Windows Server operating system here. right? I'm going to be using uh, Windows Server 2016. That is what I will be using here. And you can decide to install the operating system later, or you can do it right now. So I'm going to do it right now. And here you have to import the ISO file, the file containing the Windows Server. So I already downloaded mine. So I'm just going to browse to the location and I have it right here. That is my file. Just click on this and click on next. At this point, this is a summary of your configuration. You click on finish and your virtual machine should be ready in a couple of minutes. At this point, this is just the initial step. This virtual machine, you've done the prerequisite. It means you've gathered the resources required, the resources needed for you to be able to create this virtual machine. But it is not yet fully functional because you need to now power it on and let it install the operating system that you just mapped to it. So how do you do that? You can right click here, connect, or you can start it, or you can just double click, just like I've done right now, and it's going to pop up. Now, this is one of the trickiest parts in this because you have to prompt or you have to interrupt the boot system so that during the boot, it can pick and boot on the operating system that you've put in the ISO file. If not, it's gonna fail. And it's tricky. And the way I usually like to tell people to do this is the moment you click on start, just keep on clicking on any key on your keyboard. Click on any button on your keyboard as fast as possible so that it can interrupt the boot system and it will definitely be booting on the ISO image that we just put in this virtual machine. So I'm going to click here very quick and you will hear me probably clicking on my keyboard and just clicking everywhere to make sure that it picks up and it does that. But if it fails, then, okay, that is what I was talking about. And you see, it picked up and it's booting on that image. And you can see this is Windows Server 2019. I thought it was 2016 actually. So it is 2019. This is my image right here. And I'm ready to install my virtual machine. I'm going to leave everything default because I like US English. Click on next. And it's asking you to install now. Yes, let's install our virtual machine. It's going to take us through a couple of steps to do the configuration, and then at the end it will run the installation media and install the virtual machine for us. So now, since this is kind of like a free edition that we're using, so we're going to go with a 2019 Windows Server 2019 data center evaluation, and this I think is going to give us like 180 days of free usage. We'll go on next, and at this point I'm just going to accept the terms of license and everything. Click on next. Here, which type of installation do you want? I want a custom installation, right? I don't want to do no upgrade. I need to do my own custom installation to define whatever I need to do. So I'll take the second option. And you see here, this is a total disk size that we provided, 100 gigabit. And guess what? It is taking this size here from your physical server. X. At this point, we are done. We're just going to pause our video here and let it install. And after the installation is done, I will come back here and I'll walk us through the next step, how to log into your virtual machine. And if everything works good, then we will be happy. And that will be the end of creating a virtual machine. See you in a bit. Hello and welcome back. This time our installation is done. So the first time when you create your VM, it's going to prompt you to provide a password. And that password is what you're going to use to sign into that VM. But you can always change this password or even change the username once everything is set. So I'm going to provide my password here and finish. At this point, it's finalizing everything. From the look of things, everything went successfully. So I'm going to talk about these options here because sometimes when you create this VM and you want to make sure that you can share resources between your physical computers and the VM itself, or you can copy a file from your physical computer to the VM, then you need to click on the options, go to local resources, and then where you have more, to enable drives so that you can see all the physical drives that are sitting on your physical laptop in your VM. And you click on OK. Connect. At this point, you should connect it to your VM. And there we go. Provide your password. And we are in. I hope you learned something here, and I hope this video was helpful. In the next series of video, we will see how to create a VM, and on that VM, we are going to deploy a domain controller. We will talk about the domain controller because we want to build a cluster. So in the series of the series of videos coming up, I will show you how to create a domain controller, how to create VMs, and how to create a cluster, a Windows Server failover cluster, and how to add VMs into that cluster. Thank you and see you in the next video.